This video is going to discuss the Mesoamerican ball game called Ulama. And as we'll see, that's the present day name for the sport, which is still played in Mexico and in Mesoamerica in general, but goes back, over well before Christ, especially in the Olmec area, which we've been talking about. So it's a game that was played from very early on in the rise of complex civilizations in Mesoamerica. And indeed, no matter Olmec or Mayan or Aztec, they would all adopt this sport. And most urban centers throughout Mesoamerica, and indeed up into the American Southwest, have ball courts. So this game was very popular across different religions and cultures, and is just similar to, I'd say, more like soccer than any American sport, because for those of you who traveled abroad, you know that soccer is played by virtually is the most popular sport in virtually every country in the world except the United States. And it's not even that too dissimilar in the sense that it is a game that you cannot use your hands, although there is a lot more reliance on the hip, as far as we can tell, with the Mesoamerican ball game. Here we have some depictions here of a modern, guy playing in the upper right, and Ulama is the modern name for the sport. The bottom right is a depiction, a contemporary depiction of the game, and the bottom left is a drawing that was made for a king of Spain, I believe. And he was actually entertained by some of these players after the game was discovered, or the New World was discovered, for that matter. Now, here we see here that some of the ideas about the game. It's we see one of its name there, Olomalitzlib. And they say it's a combination of soccer and basketball. I remember when I was younger, we were always told that the Aztecs created the game of basketball, and I guess was based on this idea. Um, uh, and so the idea was to bounce this rubber ball through the hoop here, which we can see on the upper right, in this very sort of condensed depiction of the ball court. And you could not touch it with your hands. And sometimes these games were indeed played to the death. And conflicts can be resolved even between different nationalities with these games. So sometimes it can take on very serious repercussions. And here are some of the upper left, some of the names that were given by the different cultures: the classic Mayan, the Aztec, and the modern name. And we'll just use a modern name for now. Now, here, the really, really important thing here is this is the first ball game we know of to use rubber balls. Once again, rubber is a New World. It was a New World plant, the rubber tree, and so rubber was unknown to the Europeans until they came to the New World, where this game has been being played for a while. As I'll show you in a little bit, these rubber balls were, very dense and quite heavy. But I want to point out here that what's interesting is that there are many different shapes to these ball courts. There are certain things that are steady in them, like, for example, this central, it's eye-shaped or sometimes T-shaped field with the walls at the side. Sometimes the walls are slanted, sometimes they are not. But this is where the hoop would be. We believe one of the ideas of the game was to keep the ball in motion as much as possible, and that if you let it out of motion, perhaps touch the ground, that was losing a point. But also you would try to get it through the hoop. But we're not sure. We don't have many of the rules of the game preserved for us. Here is another depiction where we can see the important parts of the ball field or the ball court. Here we have sort of a T-shaped one with the end zone on the bottom right, and on the upper left there is just a wall. But as I said, sometimes they could be eye-shaped. And then it has the tilted walls that they call aprons here, and the bench walls, etc. So it's unclear to how much the getting it through the hoop was important or not. Here's a couple different depictions of them. There's some guys on the upper left playing in a modern, or not, some modern replicas of the ball court, playing for advantage. On the bottom right, we see the drawing of an eye-shaped one with the hoops on either side. On the upper right, we see these skulls associated with the seats, and death seems to be replicated a lot in these fields, or trips to the underworld, put it that way. And so we believe that a lot of times the loser of this game would die, be sacrificed. And if you were the winner, you were given this crazy little belt or hoop that you wore around your waist, that signified that you were a winner of one of these games. And these winners would become very, very important people in the societies. Once again, here we see some of the different courts. Upper left, we can see it's straight walled, slanted walls. On upper right, lower left. And on the bottom right, we can see there's slanted walls, but they're a lot shallower. So every city had a ball court, but they had different scales, similar to baseball fields, right? As you all know, no two baseball fields are exactly alike. They have some basic things, the distances between bases, etc., and the pitcher's mound to the home plate. But the home run wall can be very short or very far, very near, very far away, depending on where you are. That's why, for example, some of the great home run hitters, people say, well, that's because their home field had a very close wall, a near wall, home run wall. I don't know enough to really say one way or the other, but just to point out that there are variations in these fields from city to city, but with some basic fundamental ideas like the ball court itself. And here, once again, on the left, we see some ones with different shaped walls. But here is the hoop on the right, and this is what we believe you would have to get this small rubber ball that's about 20 centimeters or so in diameter and weighed probably about 20 pounds because it was solid rubber. So it was very, very hard. So hard it could break bones. And it is even recorded by the sources of contemporary sources of these balls seriously bruising and hurting people. So you had to know what you were doing. And as we'll see, they wore hip cloths that were padded so that it would not hurt them when they hit the ball. Here I show you this slide, once again, just to show you different courts. And the image on the left with the cross-section just shows you how, the courts had the same general idea, but could vary on place to place. And talk about giving you a home court advantage. I mean, when they were so drastically different as this, it could make, it made quite a difference in how you play the game. One can only imagine. And here are some depictions, contemporary depictions of the game here. We're not certain on a lot of details of it, but we believe there's more than one person on each side. Probably 3 to 4 players on each side. And the idea was trying either to get it through the hoops that are depicted there, or perhaps past the central line. And as I said, these some of these people could be killed if they lost the match. Now, in both of these, they hold it by the hand, but we believe that at best that's probably just for how they began the game or something. But it seems to have been played via with the hips and shoulders and elbows from that point on. I don't know if they had headers or not. Here are just some other depictions of and on the upper left we see a modern reenactment of it. On the upper right, we see a drawing from the time, and we can see how heavy the clothing was that they would wear to cover their hips. And then they wear these extravagant helmets as well to really make quite a display during the game. We see, on the bottom right, there's two images showing, eye-shaped courts. On the left, here's one of the rubber balls. Once again, rubber was unknown to the Europeans at the time. So ball games like this, just didn't exist, right? Because they didn't have rubber. And imagine that. I mean, it's how much we use rubber now and how important it is. But here is one of those balls, and once I said they're very, very, very hard and heavy, and you would have had to make sure when you hit this with your hip, you hit it correctly. You didn't want this thing hitting you in the head because it could break your skull, and it broke bones frequently. Here is some more ball courts. I just want to point out, the one on the left gives you the general idea of the shape. Here are the end zones, we might call them, are pretty large, but that can vary. I do want to point out the one at Chichen Itza, which is a site we're going to come back to a lot, and starts to be used in the Olmec period, but continues on for a long time, has the largest of these courts. And so this game was extraordinarily popular. And just like we have, baseball and football fields, in every city, well, not football fields, but certainly baseball fields. This was a sport that was shared cross-culturally and over a long period of time. Now, the games were played in partially in honor of this god called the were-jaguar, which I'll come back to later on, but it was an important deity. You're probably familiar with the word were from werewolf. Were is just an old English word for man. And so this is the jaguar man. And he is frequently shown, as he's shown here, with these long locks on the side, a big crown, and then a downward turning face, or mouth rather, frowning somewhat, and this broad nose. Here we have a depiction of the players, and just to give you an idea of just how gaudy their clothing was. They really had a lot of on, but you have to imagine that this ball was quite heavy when it hit them. In this depiction, it seems that the ball is exaggerated in size, but it gets the idea with the central location of the ball that, this is what it's all about. And there seems to be one person playing here, and then three, referees or observers watching it. But we see him kneel down and then hit it with his hip. Here's another depiction, very common, these depictions, and showing this man heavily dressed with his clothing and the Mayan glyphs, and then he is, hitting the ball with his hip. So, just as true as in, many societies, these games were central to Mesoamerican societies. And once again, though our earliest evidence was the Olmec, they would continue on. And in fact, the game is still played, and that's where we get the name Ulama, even though it had different names, in the past. And just one final slide to show you once again the contemporary depictions of people playing the game. And once again, I can't emphasize enough just the highly decorative and ornate clothing that was worn during this game to add to its spectacle nature. And it's just also one final thought to keep in mind is that one of the things when we say we're of the same culture, there are many things that we can share. We can share languages, we can share religion, holidays, food, familial structure, etc. But also frequently, what is quite common are games that are shared. Now, we might say, well, if when we look into this, a lot of times, like prisoners of war were used, and death could result if you lost the match. But this didn't seem to decrease its popularity. I mean, the same is true with the Roman gladiatorial events. Prisoners of war were frequently thrown in for the slaughter. But nevertheless, gladiatorial events were watched everywhere, even in these conquered territories. So it's just one of those things that the game sort of supersedes all those. But this game was observed when the Spanish got to the New World. And indeed, as I said, they would take players back home to show them how it was played. But also, it introduced rubber. And rubber, as we know, would just then become used for many, many, many different things. But ball games, European ball games, well, I don't know, ball games just didn't exist, I presume. Whatever games they had, jousting or something, I don't know. But they didn't include these. So the New World, in many ways, we need to be thankful to them for introducing the rubber ball. I mean, think about all the sports that sort of need a rubber ball or a variation of that. And soccer, by far, being the most common one, and it's a very uniting sport throughout the world. If any of you've ever had a chance to be abroad during the World Cup, you realize that the whole world is focused on these soccer games between different countries, except the USA. For some reason, it just is not that big here. But it was quite big there, and it was played in all the various Mesoamerican villages.